What if the wolves of Ironwood Forest weren't just animals, but guardians of a secret older than humanity? When Jonah followed a wounded wolf into the heart of the wilderness, he uncovered a hidden sanctuary, and a truth that Everest Biotech would stop at nothing to control. Will he protect the legacy his father died for, or lose it all? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. The wind howled like a restless spirit, whipping through the desolate plains of Willowridge, Wyoming. Snow fell in thick sheets, blanketing the world in an eerie silence. 16-year-old Jonah Rivers tugged his threadbare coat tighter against his body as he trudged through the storm. The freezing air bit at his cheeks, but he ignored it. His family's survival depended on him. "Just a quick check of the fences," he muttered to himself, the words barely audible over the roar of the wind. The cattle had been restless lately, their uneasy behaviour mirroring the whispers of danger that always seemed to circulate this time of year. Jonah's mother, Miriam Rivers, had warned him to stay close to the house, but the storm's ferocity left him no choice. Their ranch, perched on the edge of Ironwood Forest, had been in the family for generations. It was their livelihood and their legacy. But these days, it felt more like a burden. Ever since his father's disappearance 2 years ago, Jonah and Miriam had struggled to keep everything running. The forest loomed as both a protector and a threat, a mystery no one in Willowridge dared to unravel. As Jonah neared the edge of the forest, a faint sound pierced the storm's monotony, a low, pained whimper. He froze, straining to hear through the wind. The sound came again, sharper this time, tugging at something deep inside him. Curiosity battled caution, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. Jonah stepped off the well-worn path, his boots crunching through the deep snow. As he followed the sound into the shadows of the trees, the forest swallowed him whole, its ancient pines standing sentinel against the storm. The whimper grew louder, leading him to a small clearing where the snow was disturbed by streaks of crimson. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes fell on the source of the noise. A massive wolf, its paw caught in the cruel jaws of a steel trap. Its coat was a mixture of silver and grey, blending seamlessly with the snowy landscape. But it was its eyes that held Jonah captive. Golden and piercing, they locked onto him with a mix of pain, fear, and something else. Something Jonah couldn't quite name. The wolf growled weakly as he approached, baring its teeth. Its strength was waning, but its spirit was unbroken. Jonah hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. Every story he'd ever heard about wolves told him this was a bad idea, and yet he couldn't leave. "You're hurt," Jonah said softly, his voice trembling as he crouched a safe distance away. The wolf's ears flicked, but it didn't look away. I can help." He glanced at the trap, its steel jaws biting deep into the wolf's flesh. Blood stained the snow beneath it, and Jonah felt a pang of anger at whoever had left such a cruel device in the forest. Carefully, he pulled off his gloves and reached for the trap. The wolf's growl deepened, but it didn't lunge. "Easy," Jonah whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." His hands trembled as he pried at the trap's frozen mechanism. The metal was cold and unyielding, biting into his skin as he struggled. The wolf whimpered again, its golden eyes never leaving his face. Finally, with a sharp click, the trap released. Jonah jumped back as the wolf yanked its paw free, limping a few steps before collapsing in the snow. For a moment, neither moved. Jonah's heart thundered in his chest as the wolf stared at him, its gaze heavy with something he couldn't explain. Then, to his astonishment, it lowered its head as if in thanks. "You're welcome," Jonah murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The moment shattered as the sound of distant voices reached his ears. He turned, his stomach twisting in fear. Through the storm, he could make out the faint glow of flashlights moving through the forest. They're coming for you," he said, realization dawning. The wolf growled low, its ears flattening against its head. Jonah looked back at it, his mind racing. He couldn't leave it here. Not like this. "Come on," he urged, gesturing for the wolf to follow. "You'll be safer at the ranch." To his amazement, the wolf seemed to understand. It struggled to its feet, limping after him as he led the way back through the trees. The flashlights grew brighter, the voices louder. But Jonah pushed forward, his heart pounding. By the time they reached the barn, the storm had intensified, masking their tracks. Jonah helped the wolf inside, quickly closing the door behind them. The barn was old and unused, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of the snow. Jonah grabbed an old blanket and spread it on the floor, creating a makeshift bed. The wolf collapsed onto it, its breathing laboured but steady. Jonah retrieved a first aid kit from a nearby shelf, his hands shaking as he cleaned the wound. The wolf didn't fight him, its golden eyes watching his every move. "You're a fighter," Jonah said softly, his voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything like you." For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of the wolf's steady breathing. Jonah felt a strange sense of calm, as if he'd crossed some invisible boundary into a world he didn't fully understand. But the calm didn't last. A sharp knock on the barn door made his heart leap. "Jonah?" It was Miriam's voice, laced with worry. Jonah glanced at the wolf, which had tensed but didn't growl. He took a deep breath, steeling himself as he opened the door just enough to see his mother's face. "What are you doing out here?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked past him into the barn. "You've been gone for hours. I thought you were—" Her voice trailed off as she spotted the blanket and the faint bloodstains on the floor. "What's going on, Jonah?" Jonah hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't tell her, not yet. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just cleaning up. I'll be inside soon." Miriam's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before she nodded reluctantly. "Don't stay out too long. It's dangerous tonight." As she walked away, Jonah closed the door and turned back to the wolf. "Looks like we're in this together now," he said. The wolf's golden eyes glimmered in the dim light, and Jonah felt an unspoken connection settle between them. He didn't know what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The storm had quieted by the time dawn broke over Willow Ridge, but the biting chill remained. Inside the barn, Jonah stirred from a restless sleep, his back pressed against a pile of old hay bales. His first thought was the wolf. He turned to see the animal lying on the makeshift bed, its golden eyes open and watching him. The wolf's breathing was steady, but its injured paw remained tucked protectively beneath its body. Jonah noticed how calm it looked despite the circumstances, almost as though it trusted him. "You made it through the night," he said softly, his breath visible in the freezing air. "That's a good sign." The wolf didn't move, but its gaze held his, piercing and steady. Jonah felt the strange connection from the previous night return, a sense that this was no ordinary animal. It wasn't just the intelligence in its eyes, it was the way it carried itself, as if it understood far more than it should. Jonah reached for the first aid kit, preparing to check the bandages. "Let's see how bad it is," he murmured. As he approached, the wolf didn't growl or flinch, merely watching him with an unnerving stillness. He carefully unwrapped the bandage and examined the paw. The wound looked cleaner than he'd expected, though the raw flesh made his stomach churn. He cleaned it again, whispering reassurances as he worked. "It's not as bad as it could have been. You're lucky." Once he finished, Jonah stepped back, giving the wolf space. It lowered its head onto its uninjured paw, its eyes half closed. Jonah felt a wave of relief, but his reprieve was short-lived. A familiar voice called from the house. "Jonah, breakfast!" His mother. Jonah glanced at the wolf, then back at the barn door. He couldn't leave it alone for too long, not with those men still out there. But he also couldn't risk raising his mother's suspicions. "I'll be back," he promised, grabbing a thick blanket and draping it over the wolf's shivering body. "Stay quiet, okay?" The wolf made no sound as he slipped out of the barn and headed toward the house. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen was a welcome contrast to the bitter cold. The scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. Miriam Rivers stood at the stove, her auburn hair tied back and a tired look on her face. She glanced over her shoulder as Jonah entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You were out there all night," she said, her tone half worried, half accusing. "What were you doing?" "Checking the fences," Jonah lied smoothly, grabbing a plate from the counter. "The storm knocked some branches down. I wanted to make sure the cattle didn't get out." Miriam frowned but didn't press the issue. Instead, she handed him a mug of coffee. "Next time, wait until daylight. It's not safe in that forest." Jonah sipped the coffee, its warmth spreading through him. "Why isn't it safe?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Miriam hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the window. "You know why," she said quietly. "Your father. The forest isn't what it seems, Jonah. It never has been." Jonah set his mug down, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What aren't you telling me?" Miriam shook her head, returning her attention to the stove. "I've told you enough. Just stay away from the tree line, especially after dark." Jonah wanted to press her further, but the tension in her voice warned him not to push. Instead, he focused on his breakfast, his mind racing with questions. What did his father know about the forest? Why had he spent so much time out there before he disappeared? Later that morning, Jonah returned to the barn, carrying scraps of leftover bacon wrapped in a napkin. The wolf perked up at the smell, its nose twitching. Jonah held out the food, staying just far enough away to avoid startling it. "You must be starving," he said. The wolf sniffed the offering before gingerly taking it from his hand. Jonah watched as it ate, marveling at how graceful its movements were despite its injury. As the wolf finished, it stood and limped toward the far corner of the barn. Jonah frowned as it began to paw at the ground, revealing a patch of dirt beneath the straw. It scratched deliberately, carving shallow lines into the earth. "What are you doing?" Jonah murmured, stepping closer. When the wolf stopped, Jonah's breath caught. The marks weren't random. They formed a deliberate pattern, straight lines intersecting at odd angles, with small circles placed at key points. The sight was eerily familiar. He knelt beside the markings, his mind racing. He'd seen something like this before, sketched in the pages of his father's journal. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Jonah hurried back to the house, careful not to draw Miriam's attention as he retrieved the old journal from its hiding place beneath his bed. He flipped through the worn pages, his heart pounding as he searched for the familiar symbols. There, a drawing of intersecting lines and circles, almost identical to the ones the wolf had scratched into the dirt. His father's handwriting filled the margins, notes scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic script. "Guardians of the forest, a bridge between worlds. Their intelligence defies explanation." Jonah stared at the words, a sense of awe and unease washing over him. Was his father talking about the wolves? Was this wolf one of the guardians he'd written about? He closed the journal, his mind racing. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to start. That afternoon, Jonah headed into town under the pretense of picking up supplies. In reality, he was looking for someone who might know more about his father's work. He found himself at the doorstep of Miles Keaton, an old friend of his father's, and a man with a reputation for knowing more than he let on. Miles opened the door, his weathered face breaking into a faint smile. "Jonah Rivers," he said, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here?" Jonah hesitated before pulling the journal from his bag. "I need to know what my dad was working on before he disappeared." Miles's expression darkened as he took the journal. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "Your father was a brilliant man," he said, "too brilliant for his own good. He was chasing something big, Jonah, something people didn't want him to find." "What do you mean?" Jonah pressed. Miles sighed, setting the journal down. "Everest Biotech. They've been sniffing around these parts for years, looking for, well, let's just say they're not interested in preserving the forest. Your dad got too close to whatever they were hiding, and I think it cost him." Jonah felt a knot form in his stomach. "What were they hiding?" Miles glanced out the window, his voice lowering. "Legends talk about the wolves of Ironwood being more than just animals. They're protectors, guardians of something ancient. Your dad believed it too. He thought they held knowledge we couldn't even begin to understand." Jonah's mind flashed to the symbols in the barn and the wolf's piercing eyes. Do you think they're still out there?" Miles nodded. "I'd bet my life on it. But if Everest gets their hands on them, it's over. Those wolves are worth more than you can imagine to people like them." As Jonah left Miles' house, his thoughts swirled with fear and determination. The wolf wasn't just an animal, it was part of something much bigger. And now, he was part of it too. Returning to the barn, Jonah found the wolf waiting for him, its golden eyes glowing in the dim light. It watched as he knelt beside it, pulling the journal from his bag. "We're going to figure this out," Jonah said, his voice steady. "Whatever my dad was trying to protect, I'll protect it too." The wolf blinked slowly, as if acknowledging his words. In that moment, Jonah felt a flicker of purpose, a connection not just to the wolf, but to the forest and its secrets. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't turning back. The sky over Willow Ridge had cleared, leaving the world bright and frozen under the pale winter sun. Jonah stood at the barn door, staring out at the endless expanse of white. The wolf, still recovering, lay quietly behind him on the blanket. Its injured paw was tucked under its chest, but its golden eyes were alert, following Jonah's every move. Jonah turned back, holding his father's journal tightly in his hands. The symbols scratched into the dirt by the wolf had haunted him all night. They weren't random marks, they were deliberate. He couldn't shake the feeling that the wolf was trying to tell him something. "Why are you here?" he murmured, crouching down a few feet from the animal. "What do you want me to understand?" The wolf blinked slowly, its gaze steady. It shifted slightly, wincing as it moved its injured paw. Jonah reached for the blanket, adjusting it to keep the wolf warm. It didn't flinch, and Jonah felt a strange sense of gratitude radiating from the creature. Jonah sighed and opened the journal again, flipping to the section with the symbols. His father's notes described the markings as a language of connection, referencing patterns in nature and mathematics. Jonah had skimmed these pages before, but never fully understood them. Now, with the wolf here, the notes took on new meaning. "Guardians of the forest," Jonah read aloud, tracing the scrawled words. "They hold the knowledge of balance passed down through generations." He glanced at the wolf, whose ears perked at the sound of his voice. "Are you one of them? A guardian?" The wolf didn't answer, of course, but Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that it understood him. That afternoon, Jonah decided to venture deeper into Ironwood Forest. He needed to find more answers, and he had a feeling the symbols were the key. Leaving the wolf in the barn, he bundled up against the cold and set off toward the tree line. The forest was still and quiet, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the snow. Jonah followed the trail he'd taken the night before, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the strange markings. His breath clouded in the air as he walked, the weight of the journal heavy in his backpack. After nearly an hour of searching, he found what he was looking for. A massive pine tree stood alone in a small clearing, its bark etched with the same symbols the wolf had drawn in the barn. Jonah's pulse quickened as he approached, his fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface. The markings were intricate, forming patterns that seemed both deliberate and organic. Jonah pulled the journal from his bag, comparing the sketches to the tree. They matched almost perfectly. "What does it mean?" he whispered, his breath visible in the icy air. A rustling sound behind him made him spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. For a moment he saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then a figure stepped into view. It was Miles Keaton, his father's old friend. He wore a heavy coat and carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you out here," Miles said, his voice low. Jonah hesitated, his grip tightening on the journal. "I'm looking for answers." Miles glanced at the tree, his gaze lingering on the symbols. "Your dad used to spend hours out here studying these things. He was convinced they were important. Do you know what they mean?" Jonah asked, stepping closer. Miles shook his head. "Not exactly. But your dad thought they were part of something bigger, a way the wolves communicate, not just with each other, but with the forest itself." Jonah frowned, trying to process the idea. How is that even possible? Miles sighed, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "Your dad always said there's more to this world than we understand. These wolves, they're not like any others. They're smarter, more connected. Some people believe they're just animals, but your dad thought they were something else entirely. A guardians." Jonah said, the word feeling heavy on his tongue. Miles nodded slowly. Yeah, that's what he called them, guardians of balance. Before Jonah could ask more, a distant sound cut through the silence, a low, mournful howl. Jonah's heart raced as he turned toward the sound. They're close, Miles said, his voice tense. We should head back. Jonah shook his head. I need to find out more. I think the wolf in the barn is trying to tell me something. Miles froze, his eyes narrowing. You have one of them. Jonah hesitated, realizing too late that he'd said too much. It's injured. I couldn't just leave it out here. Miles swore under his breath, his expression darkening. Jonah, you don't know what you're messing with. If Everest finds out, I'm not letting them take it. Jonah interrupted, his voice firm. I don't care what they want. Miles stared at him for a long moment before nodding. Then you'd better be careful. They won't stop until they get what they're after. When Jonah returned to the barn, the wolf was waiting for him, its golden eyes glowing in the dim light. He knelt beside it, pulling the journal from his bag. I found more symbols, he said, showing the wolf the sketches. They match the ones you made. Is this what you're trying to tell me? The wolf shifted slightly, its gaze flickering to the journal. Jonah felt a strange sense of understanding pass between them, as if the wolf were confirming his suspicions. As he studied the pages, a thought struck him. His father's notes mentioned a specific location deep in the forest, a place he called the Sanctuary. Jonah had always assumed it was just a story, but now he wasn't so sure. Is that where you came from? Jonah asked, looking at the wolf. The Sanctuary? The wolf didn't move, but its eyes seemed to say yes. Jonah's mind raced. If the Sanctuary was real, it might hold the answers he was looking for. But finding it wouldn't be easy, especially with Everest Biotech closing in. That night, Jonah lay awake in his room, the journal open on his bed. He traced the symbols with his finger, his thoughts swirling. The wolves weren't just animals. They were something more, something his father had spent his life trying to protect. But why? What was so important that he'd risk everything, even his family, to keep it safe? A soft sound outside his window snapped him out of his thoughts. He sat up, his heart pounding as he listened. There it was again, a faint scratching, like claws on wood. Jonah got up and opened the window. The wolf was there, staring up at him from the snow. Its injured paw was wrapped in the blanket he'd left it, but it stood tall, its gaze intense. Jonah climbed down and followed the wolf as it limped toward the tree line. The air was bitterly cold, but Jonah barely felt it. He was too focused on the wolf, which moved with purpose despite its injury. They reached the edge of the forest, where the wolf paused and looked back at him. Jonah hesitated, his breath visible in the icy air. Is this where it starts? He asked softly. The wolf didn't answer, but its gaze was all the confirmation he needed. Jonah took a deep breath and stepped into the trees, following the wolf into the darkness. The night enveloped Jonah and the wolf as they ventured deeper into Ironwood Forest. The air grew heavier, the silence broken only by the crunch of snow beneath Jonah's boots and the soft, laboured breathing of the wolf. Overhead, the skeletal branches of the ancient pines seemed to reach for the sky, their shadows weaving an intricate pattern on the forest floor. Jonah's heart raced as he followed the wolf, his father's journal tucked safely under his arm. The weight of the mystery and the danger pressed heavily on him. Every step into the forest felt like stepping further into a world he didn't fully understand. This is insane, he muttered to himself, his breath visible in the frigid air. I'm following a wolf like it's going to lead me to… what? Answers? But even as he questioned himself, Jonah knew he couldn't turn back. Something about the wolf's purposeful movements, the way it glanced over its shoulder as if ensuring he was still behind, gave him the sense that this was exactly where he needed to be. After what felt like hours, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, and the air carried a faint hum, a vibration Jonah could feel in his chest. The wolf stopped suddenly, its golden eyes fixed on something ahead. Jonah squinted into the darkness, his pulse quickening. Then he saw it. A jagged rock formation jutted out of the ground, its surface covered in snow and ice. At its base was a narrow opening, barely large enough for Jonah to squeeze through. The wolf limped toward the entrance, pausing to look back at him. "You want me to go in there?" Jonah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The wolf didn't move, its eyes glowing in the dim light. Jonah swallowed hard and nodded. "All right, let's see what's inside." The cave was colder than Jonah expected, the air sharp and metallic. He crouched low to avoid scraping his head on the rough ceiling, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The wolf followed close behind, its injured paw making soft thuds on the rocky floor. As they moved deeper, Jonah began to notice markings on the walls. At first, they were faint and scattered, but the further they went, the more intricate and deliberate they became. He stopped to examine one of the patterns, running his fingers over the grooves etched into the stone. "These are the same symbols," he whispered, flipping open his father's journal. The sketches matched perfectly, the lines and circles forming patterns that seemed both mathematical and organic. Jonah's heart pounded as he traced the markings. "He was here." The wolf let out a low whine, nudging Jonah's arm. It moved ahead, leading him to a larger chamber where the walls seemed to glow faintly with an otherworldly light. Jonah froze, his breath catching in his throat. The chamber was enormous, its walls covered from floor to ceiling with carvings. The symbols were arranged in intricate patterns, spiraling outward like a map of the stars. In the center of the room stood a raised stone platform, its surface smooth and polished. Jonah stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He felt a strange energy in the air, a hum that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. The wolf limped to the platform and lay down beside it, its golden eyes watching him intently. This is it," Jonah said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "This is what you wanted me to see." Jonah spent what felt like hours exploring the chamber. The symbols were mesmerizing, their meaning just out of reach. His father's journal provided some clues, but it was clear that much of the language was still a mystery. One particular section of the wall caught Jonah's attention. The carvings here were different, more detailed, almost three-dimensional. They depicted scenes of wolves standing beside humans, their poses regal and protective. Above them were symbols that Jonah recognized as star constellations. "It's a story," he realized, his voice filled with awe. "They're trying to tell us something." He read aloud from his father's notes, piecing together fragments of the narrative. "The wolves are guardians. They've been here for generations, watching over the forest, protecting something ancient." The wolf let out a soft growl, drawing Jonah's attention. It stood and limped to a smaller alcove in the chamber, nudging a pile of loose stones with its nose. Jonah followed, clearing the stones to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, weathered box. Jonah opened it carefully, his hands shaking. Inside, he found a bundle of papers, maps, notes, and sketches, all in his father's handwriting. "Dad," Jonah whispered, his throat tightening. The papers detailed his father's exploration of the cave, his theories about the wolves, and his warnings about Everest Biotech. "They're coming," one note read. "They know about the sanctuary. If they find it, they'll destroy everything." Jonah clenched his fists, anger and determination surging through him. "They're not going to take this place," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the chamber. "I won't let them." As Jonah gathered the papers, a sudden sound broke the silence, a distant rumble, like the growl of an engine. The wolf's ears perked and it growled low in its throat. Jonah's stomach twisted as he realized what it meant. "They're here," he said, his voice barely audible. He grabbed the box and the journal, shoving them into his backpack. The wolf limped toward the entrance, its movements quick despite its injury. Jonah followed, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he ran. The sound of voices reached them as they neared the cave's mouth. Jonah turned off his flashlight, pressing himself against the wall. He peeked out and saw the glow of flashlights and the glint of metal. "Guns. Search the area," a voice commanded. "The kid and the wolf are close." Jonah's heart pounded as he looked at the wolf. "We have to get out of here," he whispered. The wolf seemed to understand. It nudged Jonah toward a narrow passageway at the back of the chamber. Jonah hesitated, glancing at the approaching figures. If they found the cave, it would all be over. He pulled a handful of loose rocks from the floor and scattered them near the entrance, creating a false trail leading deeper into the forest. Then, he followed the wolf into the passageway, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The passageway was narrow and dark, the air thick and suffocating. Jonah crawled on his hands and knees, the wolf just ahead of him. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps and voices behind them, but the passage twisted and turned, making it difficult to tell how close they were. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into another clearing. Jonah stumbled out, gasping for air. The wolf stood beside him, its ears flicking as it listened for any sign of pursuit. "We made it," Jonah said, collapsing against a tree. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't safe yet. The men from Everest Biotech wouldn't stop until they found what they were looking for. The wolf nudged Jonah's arm, its golden eyes fierce and determined. Jonah nodded, his resolve hardening. "All right," he said, standing. "Let's go." As they disappeared into the forest, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The cave had given him answers, but it had also raised more questions. What were the wolves protecting? Why had his father sacrificed so much to keep it hidden? And most importantly, how was Jonah going to stop Everest Biotech from destroying everything? The cold night air burned Jonah's lungs as he ran through the snow-covered forest, the wolf limping beside him. The distant voices of Everest Biotech agents echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing moment. Jonah's mind raced as he tried to focus on the path ahead, dodging low-hanging branches and avoiding hidden patches of ice. "Keep moving," he whispered, though the words were as much for himself as for the wolf. "We can't let them catch us." The wolf's golden eyes flicked toward him, its pace unwavering despite its injury. Jonah marveled at the animal's resilience, but he couldn't ignore the guilt gnawing at him. The wolf was hurt because of him, because he'd brought it to the barn, because he'd followed it into the forest. "They won't stop," he muttered, gripping his backpack tighter. Inside were the journal, his father's notes, and the maps he'd found in the cave. They were all that remained of his father's legacy, and the key to understanding the wolves' secret. The forest grew denser as they pushed further from the cave. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Jonah slowed, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He glanced back, straining to hear over the pounding of his heart. The voices had faded, but he knew the agents wouldn't give up so easily. Everest Biotech had too much at stake. They weren't just hunting the wolf, they were hunting the knowledge it guarded. "Where now?" Jonah asked, his voice barely audible. The wolf stopped, its ears twitching as it scanned the forest. After a moment, it turned sharply to the left, limping toward a faint trail that Jonah hadn't noticed before. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder, before following. The trail led to a small clearing, where a frozen creek wound its way through the trees. Jonah knelt beside the water, cupping his hands to take a sip. The cold bit at his skin, but it was refreshing after the frantic escape. The wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, its ears alert. Jonah noticed the way it scanned the surroundings, its body tense and ready. It wasn't just surviving, it was protecting him. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Jonah said, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. The wolf didn't respond, but its gaze was answer enough. Jonah sighed and adjusted his backpack. "All right, lead the way." As they moved further into the forest, Jonah's thoughts returned to the cave. The symbols, the carvings, his father's notes, it was all connected, but the pieces didn't fit together yet. What was the wolves' purpose? What were they protecting? And why was it so important? The answer felt just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Jonah shook his head, forcing himself to focus. If they didn't make it out of the forest, the answers wouldn't matter. A sudden noise shattered his thoughts, the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping underfoot. Jonah froze, his breath catching in his throat. The wolf crouched low, its golden eyes scanning the shadows. Then came the voices, closer this time. "They've got to be around here," one man said, his tone sharp and impatient. "The tracks lead this way." Jonah's heart raced as he looked around, searching for an escape route. The wolf nudged his leg, drawing his attention to a thick cluster of bushes nearby. Without thinking, Jonah dropped to the ground and crawled into the undergrowth, pulling the wolf after him. They lay motionless, the wolf's warm body pressed against Jonah's side. Through the gaps in the branches, Jonah could see the faint glow of flashlights moving through the trees. He held his breath, willing himself to be still. "Keep searching," another voice barked. "That kid's got the journal, and I want it." Jonah's stomach twisted. They knew about the journal. His father's work wasn't just a mystery to uncover, it was a target. He clenched his fists, anger and fear coursing through him. The voices grew fainter as the agents moved away, their flashlights disappearing into the distance. Jonah waited several minutes before daring to move. He let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with adrenaline. "That was close," he whispered, looking at the wolf. It met his gaze, its golden eyes calm and steady. Jonah felt a surge of gratitude and something deeper, trust. They continued through the forest, their movements cautious and deliberate. The wolf seemed to know the terrain intimately, guiding Jonah along paths that were nearly invisible to the untrained eye. It stopped occasionally, sniffing the air or listening for sounds Jonah couldn't hear. As they climbed a steep hill, Jonah's legs burned with effort. The cold bit at his face, and his backpack felt heavier with each step. But he pushed on, driven by the wolf's unwavering determination. When they reached the top, Jonah stopped to catch his breath. The view below took his breath away. The forest stretched out like an endless sea of white and green, the moonlight casting a faint glow over the landscape. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice soft. The wolf stood beside him, its gaze fixed on the horizon. But Jonah's moment of awe was short-lived. In the distance, he spotted a cluster of moving lights. Flashlights. The agents were still following them. "They're relentless," Jonah muttered, his jaw tightening. He turned to the wolf. "What now?" The wolf sniffed the air, its ears flicking. Then it turned and began descending the other side of the hill, its movements deliberate and confident. Jonah followed, his heart pounding. As they reached the base of the hill, the forest opened into another clearing. This one was different, smaller, more enclosed. At its center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like twisted arms. The wolf approached the tree, circling it slowly. Jonah watched, his curiosity piqued. The tree's bark was covered in moss and snow, but beneath the layers, Jonah could see faint carvings, symbols similar to those in the cave. "This is part of it, isn't it?" Jonah said, stepping closer. "Another piece of the puzzle." The wolf let out a soft growl, nudging a patch of snow with its nose. Jonah crouched down, brushing the snow away to reveal more carvings. These were newer, more deliberate. They formed a pattern that Jonah recognized from his father's notes. A map, he realized, tracing the lines with his fingers. "This is a map." The wolf barked once, a sharp, commanding sound. Jonah looked up, his pulse quickening. The wolf's ears were pinned back, its gaze fixed on the forest behind them. "They're here," Jonah whispered, standing. He grabbed his backpack and turned to the wolf. "We have to move." The wolf led him away from the clearing, its pace faster now despite its injury. Jonah's heart raced as they weaved through the trees, the sound of voices growing louder behind them. The chase continued for what felt like hours. Jonah's legs burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But he didn't stop. The wolf was relentless, guiding him through the forest with a determination that left no room for doubt. Finally, they reached another clearing, this one smaller and more concealed. The wolf stopped, its body tense and alert. Jonah crouched beside it, peering through the trees. The agents were close, too close. Jonah could see their flashlights flickering in the distance, their voices cutting through the night. "What now?" Jonah asked, his voice barely audible. The wolf didn't respond, but its gaze was steady, its resolve unshaken. Jonah tightened his grip on the backpack, his father's words echoing in his mind. "Protect the sanctuary, no matter what." The wolf let out a low growl, its golden eyes fierce. Jonah nodded, his fear giving way to determination. "Let's finish this," he said. The cold night deepened as Jonah and the wolf huddled in the dense undergrowth of Ironwood Forest. The faint glow of flashlights flickered in the distance. accompanied by the muffled crunch of boots on snow. Jonah's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to stay silent. The wolf lay beside him, its body tense and ready, golden eyes fixed on the approaching lights. Despite its injury, it radiated a calm intensity, as though it knew exactly what to do. Jonah gripped the straps of his backpack, feeling the weight of the journal and his father's notes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about protecting something far greater than himself. The sanctuary, the wolves, and the knowledge they guarded. It was all connected, and if Everest Biotech got their hands on it, the consequences would be catastrophic. The voices grew louder, breaking the forest's uneasy silence. "They were here," a man's voice said. "Tracks lead to this clearing." Jonah's stomach tightened. He glanced at the wolf, which was already moving, its movements slow and deliberate to avoid detection. Jonah followed, crawling on his hands and knees as they slipped further into the shadows. The flashlight swept over the undergrowth, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. Jonah's heart pounded as he and the wolf slipped through a narrow gap between two massive oaks. The snow muffled their movements, but every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves felt deafening. "They can't be far," another voice said. "Spread out." Jonah bit his lip to stifle a curse. The agents were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up. The wolf suddenly stopped, its ears pricked. Jonah froze, watching as it sniffed the air and tilted its head, listening intently. A low, guttural sound rumbled in its throat, a noise that made Jonah's skin prickle. Then it howled. The sound was low and mournful at first, but it rose into a powerful, resonant call that echoed through the forest. Jonah's eyes widened as the howl carried, its haunting melody cutting through the night like a blade. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice filled with panic. "They'll hear us." But the wolf ignored him. Its head was raised, its golden eyes closed as the howl continued. The forest seemed to respond, the air vibrating with an energy Jonah couldn't explain. Moments later, the answer came. A chorus of howls rose from the darkness, coming from all directions. Jonah felt a shiver run down his spine as the calls grew louder, filling the forest with an eerie, almost otherworldly harmony. It wasn't just a random cacophony. There was a rhythm, a purpose to the sound. "They're coming," Jonah realized, his voice barely audible. The wolf turned to him, its golden eyes gleaming with determination. Jonah felt an unspoken message pass between them. Stay calm, trust the pack. The agents faltered as the howls reached them. Jonah could hear their confusion, their uncertainty. "What the hell is that?" one of them said, his voice tinged with fear. "Wolves," another replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "Just wolves." The howls grew closer, more precise. Jonah could feel the ground vibrate beneath him as the sound enveloped them. The forest no longer felt like a place of refuge. It felt alive, as though it were watching, waiting. The wolf nudged Jonah, urging him to move. They slipped through the trees, guided by the sound of the howls. Jonah's fear began to ebb, replaced by a strange sense of hope. The wolves weren't just calling, they were leading. The chase intensified as the agents realized they were being outmaneuvered. Jonah heard them shouting, their voices growing more frantic. "They're circling us," one man yelled. "We're being herded." "Fall back," another shouted. "Regroup at the base camp." Jonah grinned despite himself. The wolves were outsmarting them, using the forest to their advantage. It was like watching a well-coordinated team execute a flawless plan. The wolf beside him let out a low bark, drawing his attention. It led him to a narrow ravine, its steep walls lined with jagged rocks. Jonah hesitated, but the wolf pressed forward, its movements confident despite its injury. "This better be worth it," Jonah muttered, following. The ravine was dark and treacherous, the path narrow and uneven. Jonah's boots slipped on the icy rocks, and he had to use his hands to steady himself. The wolf moved ahead, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. As they reached the end of the ravine, Jonah saw a faint glow ahead. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding with anticipation. The wolf stopped at the edge of another clearing, its ears flicking as it listened. Jonah stepped out of the ravine and into the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. He was standing in the center of a circle of ancient trees, their massive trunks covered in the same carvings he'd seen in the cave. At the center of the circle stood a large stone altar, its surface etched with intricate patterns. The air was thick with energy, and Jonah felt a strange warmth radiating from the altar despite the freezing temperature. "This is it," he whispered, stepping closer. "The sanctuary." The wolf let out a sharp bark, and Jonah turned to see movement in the shadows. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife in his backpack. But it wasn't the agents. Wolves emerged from the darkness, their forms sleek and powerful. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their movements were graceful, yet deliberate. Jonah counted at least a dozen, but he could sense there were more watching from the shadows. The wolf beside him stepped forward, letting out a series of low growls and whines. The other wolves responded in kind, their voices blending in a way that seemed almost musical. Jonah watched in awe as they communicated, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. "They're talking," Jonah realized. "They're sharing a plan." The wolves turned their attention to Jonah, their golden eyes studying him intently. He felt a surge of unease but stood his ground, refusing to look away. One of the wolves, larger than the rest, stepped forward. Its coat was pure white, and its eyes shone with an intensity that made Jonah's breath catch. It approached him slowly, its movements regal and commanding. Jonah instinctively knelt, holding out his hands to show he meant no harm. The white wolf stopped a few feet away, its gaze piercing. Jonah felt as though it were looking into his very soul. "I don't know what to do," Jonah said, his voice trembling. "I'm just trying to protect you, to protect this place." The white wolf let out a low growl, then turned its attention to the altar. Jonah followed its gaze, his pulse quickening. The markings on the stone seemed to glow faintly, their patterns shifting as though alive. "Is this what you're protecting?" Jonah asked, stepping closer. "What my dad was trying to keep safe." The wolves let out a series of howls, their voices blending into a powerful, haunting chorus. Jonah felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as though the wolves were reassuring him. He placed his hand on the altar, the stone warm beneath his touch. The carvings pulsed with energy, and Jonah felt a connection he couldn't explain, a bond with the wolves, the forest, and the knowledge they guarded. The moment was shattered by the sound of distant gunfire. Jonah turned, his heart sinking. The agents were closing in, and this time they weren't holding back. The white wolf let out a commanding howl, and the other wolves sprang into action. They disappeared into the shadows, their movements swift and silent. Jonah felt the wolf beside him nudge his leg, urging him to move. "We have to protect this place," Jonah said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't let them find it." The wolf let out a sharp bark, and Jonah nodded. Together they disappeared into the forest, ready to face whatever came next. The air was electric with tension as Jonah and the wolf ran through the forest, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. The wolves' howls resonated in the distance, guiding them forward. Each step Jonah took felt heavier, not from exhaustion but from the weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just about the sanctuary. It was about the balance of the forest, the legacy his father had fought to protect, and the wolves that had trusted him to stand beside them. The wolf beside Jonah, injured but resolute, pressed on with unwavering determination. Jonah's heart pounded as he glanced back, catching faint flashes of light from the agents' flashlights cutting through the trees. "They're close," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. The wolf let out a low growl, its golden eyes flicking toward him. Jonah nodded, understanding its message. Keep moving. Trust the pack. As they neared the edge of the sanctuary's boundary, Jonah noticed subtle changes in the forest. The air seemed thicker, almost alive, and the trees grew denser, their gnarled roots forming natural barricades. He realized the wolves had led him into an area designed for defense, a final stand against their pursuers. The white wolf appeared suddenly from the shadows, its regal form commanding immediate attention. Jonah stopped, his breath catching as the wolf approached. It let out a series of short, sharp howls, each one answered by other wolves hidden in the forest. "They're setting a trap," Jonah realized aloud. Watching as the pack moved into position, wolves darted between the trees, their movements coordinated and precise. Jonah marveled at their intelligence, their ability to communicate and strategize like a highly trained team. The white wolf turned to Jonah, its piercing eyes locking onto his. He felt an unspoken command, a request for trust. Jonah swallowed hard and nodded. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "Tell me what to do." The wolves guided Jonah to a vantage point on a rocky outcrop overlooking the forest. From there, he could see the agents advancing, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. They moved cautiously, their weapons drawn, but Jonah could sense their unease. The forest felt hostile, almost sentient, and the wolves' howls only added to the tension. Jonah clutched his father's journal, the pages filled with warnings and insights. His father had written about this moment, about the wolves' ability to protect the sanctuary and the delicate balance they maintained. Jonah flipped to a page he'd read dozens of times. They don't just guard the forest, they guard its soul. Without them, everything falls apart. A rustling sound drew Jonah's attention back to the forest below. The agents were close now, their voices low but tense. "Spread out," one of them ordered. "We can't let them get away." The wolves moved in silence, their forms barely visible as they weaved through the trees. Jonah watched in awe as they executed their plan, creating diversions and leading the agents further into the sanctuary's defensive zone. The first trap was sprung moments later. One of the agents stepped onto a carefully concealed patch of ice, his feet flying out from under him. He hit the ground hard, his rifle skidding away. Before he could recover, a wolf darted out of the shadows, its growl low and menacing. The man froze, his eyes wide with fear. Another agent shouted, drawing his weapon, but a second wolf appeared, cutting off his line of sight. The pack moved like shadows, using the terrain to their advantage. Jonah felt a surge of hope. The wolves weren't just surviving, they were winning. But Everest wasn't giving up easily. The agents regrouped, their leader barking orders. Jonah recognized the man, Victor Kane, Everest's head of field operations. He was tall and imposing, with a voice that carried authority and menace. "Secure the perimeter," Kane shouted. "We're not leaving without the target." Jonah's stomach twisted. Kane wasn't just after the wolves, he was after the sanctuary itself. If they found it, they would destroy everything. The wolf beside Jonah let out a soft whine, drawing his attention. It nudged his arm, its golden eyes filled with urgency. Jonah understood immediately. They needed more time. "I'll create a diversion," Jonah said, his voice shaking. He looked at the wolf, his fear replaced by determination. "Get the others to safety." The wolf hesitated, its gaze searching his. Jonah placed a hand on its uninjured shoulder, meeting its eyes. "Trust me." The wolf let out a low growl, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Jonah took a deep breath, his heart racing as he prepared to face the agents alone. Jonah moved quickly, creating noise and leaving a false trail to draw the agents away from the sanctuary. He banged a stick against a tree trunk, the sound echoing through the forest. "There!" a voice shouted. "Over there!" Jonah ran, his breath visible in the cold air. He darted between trees, his boots crunching in the snow. Flashlights swept through the darkness behind him, but he kept moving, his mind focused on one goal, protecting the wolves. The chase led him to a frozen stream, the ice glinting faintly in the moonlight. Jonah hesitated for a moment, then stepped onto the ice, his movements careful. The surface groaned under his weight, but it held. "Stop!" a voice called, and Jonah turned to see Kane standing at the edge of the stream, his rifle aimed. "Give me the journal." Jonah's heart pounded as he clutched the backpack. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't just about the wolves, the forest, the balance. It all depends on them." Kane sneered, his expression cold. "Save the speeches, kid. Hand it over, or I'll take it from you." Jonah took a step back, his boots slipping on the ice. Behind Kane, the wolves emerged from the shadows, their golden eyes glowing. Jonah's breath caught as he realized the pack was ready to strike, but Kane didn't notice. His focus was entirely on Jonah. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Jonah said, his voice steady despite his fear. "These wolves, they're more than you think." Cain raised his rifle. Last chance. Before he could fire, the white wolf appeared, its powerful form leaping from the darkness. Cain shouted in surprise, but it was too late. The wolf knocked the rifle from his hands, its growl reverberating through the forest. The rest of the pack descended, their movements precise and coordinated. The agents scattered, their formation collapsing as the wolves drove them back. Jonah watched in awe as the pack protected their territory, their strength and intelligence undeniable. The battle was over quickly. The agents, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, retreated into the forest. Cain stumbled after them, his face pale with shock. Jonah collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. The white wolf approached him, its golden eyes filled with something Jonah could only describe as gratitude. "You did it," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You protected the sanctuary." The wolf let out a low growl, then raised its head and howled. The sound was joined by the rest of the pack, their voices blending into a powerful, triumphant chorus. Jonah closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time, he felt truly connected to the wolves, to the forest, to his father's legacy. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He would fight to protect this place, no matter the cost. The forest was silent in the aftermath of the battle, the snow crunching softly under Jonah's boots as he followed the white wolf back toward the sanctuary. The air carried a weight of finality, yet beneath it was a sense of renewal, as if the forest itself had taken a deep breath and held it. Jonah's heart was still racing, the adrenaline of the encounter with Cain and the Everest agents leaving his body in waves. He glanced at the wolf beside him, its regal posture unbroken despite the night's chaos. Around them, the other wolves moved like shadows, their golden eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "We did it," Jonah whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. But even as the words left his lips, he knew their victory was only temporary. Cain and his men might have retreated, but they would return. And next time, they would come with more resources, more force. Jonah gripped his father's journal tightly. "This isn't over," he thought. "It's just beginning." As the wolves led Jonah deeper into the sanctuary, the forest seemed to shift around him. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, and the air was tinged with an earthy, ancient scent. It was as if he were stepping into another world, one untouched by time or human interference. The white wolf stopped suddenly, its ears flicking. Jonah followed its gaze to see a large stone structure partially hidden by vines and snow. It was a monolith, its surface covered in intricate carvings that mirrored the symbols he'd seen in the cave and on the altar. Jonah's breath caught. "What is this place?" The wolf let out a low growl, stepping forward. Jonah followed, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached the monolith. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. The carvings seemed to pulse with a faint energy, as if the stone itself were alive. Jonah opened his father's journal, flipping to a page marked with a hastily drawn sketch of the monolith. His father's handwriting filled the margins, the words a mix of awe and urgency. The heart of the sanctuary, the wolves' greatest secret and their greatest burden, protected at all costs. Jonah stepped back, his mind racing. His father had been here. He'd stood in this exact spot, facing the same monolith, and he'd understood its significance. But what was the secret his father had uncovered, and why was it so important to protect? The white wolf let out a sharp bark, drawing Jonah's attention. The rest of the pack had gathered around the monolith, their golden eyes fixed on him. Jonah felt a surge of emotion, pride, responsibility, and a deep sense of connection. The wolves were trusting him, not just with their sanctuary, but with their legacy. "I'll protect it," Jonah said, his voice steady. "I promise." As dawn broke over the forest, the wolves began to move, their movements purposeful and deliberate. Jonah followed as they led him through the sanctuary, showing him its hidden paths and ancient landmarks. Every step felt like a journey deeper into the heart of their world, a place where nature and wisdom intertwined. The wolves stopped at a small, crystal-clear spring surrounded by smooth stones. Jonah knelt beside the water, his reflection shimmering on the surface. He cupped his hands and drank, the cool liquid refreshing and invigorating. The white wolf stood across from him, its golden eyes filled with an intensity that made Jonah's chest tighten. It stepped forward, dipping its muzzle into the water before letting out a low, mournful howl. The sound was soft, but carried weight, a message that Jonah felt in his bones. They're not just showing me this place, he realized. They're passing it on to me. The rest of the day was spent in preparation. The wolves seemed to sense that Everest would return, and they worked tirelessly to fortify the sanctuary. Jonah helped where he could, moving branches and stones to create barriers and traps. The wolves moved with precision, their coordination seamless. Jonah marveled at their intelligence, their ability to communicate and work together. They weren't just animals, they were protectors, guardians of a balance that Jonah was only beginning to understand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wolves gathered at the altar in the center of the sanctuary. Jonah stood among them, his breath visible in the cold night air. The white wolf let out a long, resonant howl, its voice carrying through the forest. One by one, the other wolves joined in, their howls blending into a hauntingly beautiful symphony. Jonah felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just a call, it was a declaration. The wolves were ready to defend their home, no matter the cost. That night, Jonah sat by a small fire, the journal open on his lap. He flipped through its pages, reading his father's notes and sketches. The words painted a picture of a man driven by a sense of duty, a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the wolves and protecting their sanctuary. Jonah's eyes lingered on one passage, written in his father's familiar scrawl. The wolves are more than guardians. They are the keepers of a knowledge older than humanity itself. If we lose them, we lose something irreplaceable, a connection to the natural world that we can never rebuild. Jonah closed the journal, his jaw tightening. He thought of his father, of the sacrifices he'd made, and of the legacy he'd left behind. Jonah didn't know if he was ready for the responsibility, but he knew he couldn't let his father, or the wolves, down. The morning brought a grim sense of urgency. Jonah woke to the sound of distant engines, a low rumble that sent a chill down his spine. He climbed to a high vantage point, his heart sinking as he spotted a convoy of vehicles moving toward the sanctuary. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The wolves were already in motion, their movements swift and calculated. Jonah joined them, his fear replaced by determination. He wouldn't let Everest destroy what his father had fought to protect. As the agents approached the sanctuary, the forest seemed to come alive. Traps set by the wolves slowed their advance, and the dense trees made it difficult for the vehicles to maneuver. Jonah watched from a hidden perch, his heart pounding as the agents fumbled through the forest. Kane's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Move faster! We're close!" Jonah clenched his fists. He had to do something. He slid down from his perch and sprinted toward the sanctuary's center. The white wolf met him halfway, its golden eyes filled with urgency. Jonah knelt beside it, his breath coming in short gasps. "I have an idea," he said, pulling the journal from his backpack. He flipped to a page with a detailed map of the sanctuary, tracing the paths with his finger. "We can lead them into a dead end, but I'll need your help." The wolf let out a low growl, then barked sharply. The rest of the pack appeared, their movements fluid and ready. Jonah felt a surge of hope. Together, they could outsmart Everest. The plan worked flawlessly. The wolves guided the agents into a narrow gorge, where fallen trees and hidden traps slowed their progress to a crawl. Jonah watched from above, his heart racing as the agents struggled to navigate the terrain. Kane shouted orders, his frustration evident. "Keep moving, don't let them escape." But the wolves had anticipated every move. They struck from the shadows, using their speed and agility to disarm the agents without causing harm. Jonah marveled at their precision. It was as if they knew exactly how to neutralize the threat without tipping the delicate balance they protected. By the time the agents retreated, the forest was quiet once more. Jonah stood at the edge of the sanctuary, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The wolves gathered around him, their golden eyes filled with gratitude and respect. The white wolf approached, its head dipping in a gesture of trust. Jonah knelt, placing a hand on its shoulder. "We did it," he said, his voice shaking. "We protected it." The wolf let out a soft growl, then turned and led the pack back into the sanctuary. Jonah watched them go, his heart heavy with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for now, the sanctuary was safe. As the first light of dawn broke over the forest, Jonah stood beside the monolith, his father's journal in hand. He traced the carvings with his fingers, feeling a deep connection to the man who had started this journey. "I'll protect it," he whispered. "I'll protect them, no matter what." The wolves howled in the distance, their voices carrying through the trees. Jonah felt a sense of peace, knowing he was part of something far greater than himself. A legacy to protect, a bond to honor, and a future to fight for.